much for tuning in. You are experiencing a multi platform broadcast of Nuestra Palabra, Latino writers having their say. That's right, this is NPET. And I pause so you can wonder what all those letters signify. We are Nuestra Palabra extraterrestrial. Why? Because our live events became a radio broadcast, which is referred to as terrestrial radio on 90.1 FM KPFT, your community station. But we are many other platforms now as well. So you will experience this live on social media. Thanks for joining us. And you will experience the video on fox26houston.com. The audio will air on 90.1 FM KPFT, Houston's community station. And I have to remind you, dear listeners, if you have a moment, please do try and review your budget and see if you can make a donation to the station, which is listener sponsored. If you visit kpft.org, please click on the donation button and make a donation in the name of Nuestra Palabra, Latino writers having their say, so we can do our part to keep this amazing experiment in freedom of speech going. And of course, we're going to wind up visiting you live as well. I'm Tony Diaz, El Libro Traficante, and we're really excited to have on the air with us a dear friend, a major scholar, a major thinker in the nation, but he's in our own backyard, Dr. José Aranda, tenured professor at Rice University. First of all, thank you for joining us, José. It's wonderful to see you.
Great to be with you and great to be on the show. And it's just a marvelous way to start the new year.
Thank you so much. And we're going to be talking about your amazing book, The Places of Modernity in Early Mexican Literature, 1848 to 1948. Really powerful book. And we're going to get to talk to you about the book. You're going to read from the work, but we're also going to find out more about your background, your trajectory. And, I'm going to be very intentional because I know you so well. I think the world of you, but I want to also introduce you to maybe some folks that haven't been lucky enough to meet you. So I want to start off by reading your biography, if I may. And let's see. I think he's blushing. Do you have your blushing filter on? No.
It's a brown blush.
Fantastic. By the way, I love your books. I love your book display behind you.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Aranda is a professor of Chicanx and American literature at Rice University. I need to pause there because Rice is such a prestigious university, and for you to be a tenured professor there is really a statement to your work and part of the legacy of our community and basically the trail that you're blazing. You're the author of When We Arrive, A New Literary History of Mexican America from Arizona Press in 2003. You've written articles on 19th century Mexican literature and the Recovery Project, the future of Chicano studies, and most recently undertaking an investigation of the relationship between modernity and Mexican American writings entitled The Places of Modernity in Early Mexican Literature, 1848 to 1948, from the University of Nebraska Press, which is what we'll be talking about today. And you have a dual appointment in the departments of English and Modern and Classical Literature and Culture. You're a board member of Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project and also Nuestra Palabra, Latino writers having their say.
True.
Appreciate that. And you're co-founder with another dear friend of Nuestra Palabra, Priscilla Ibarra, Dr. Priscilla Ibarra, co-founders of Avanzamos, El Taller Chicano, an annual workshop focused on advanced scholarship in Chicanx studies, sponsored by Rice University and the University of North Texas. In July 2020, you joined the board of trustees of Cristo Rey Jesuit College Preparatory in Houston. Fantastic. That's such a great program where students get a world-class education for free, but then they wind up working in different professional settings, not just to get the exposure, but build a network. So we may have to talk about that as well. And in 2022, along with Carmen Lamas, Yolanda Padilla, and John Alba Cutler, you co-founded the journal Pasados, Recovering History, Imagining Latinidad at the University of Pennsylvania Press. And on the human side, besides having four too many streaming services, we got to find out your favorite shows. You also enjoy time with your family in Houston. You have a wonderful family, and who I'm privileged to know. For recreation, you love to drive your familia's 2018 GMC Savannah in the summertime. In 2021, you drove, is this a typo? 7,000 miles throughout the West. Is that a typo?
Nope. All true.
Wow. And they repeated much of that trip, plus added Waterloo, Ontario, Canada for another 7,600 miles in 2022. Welcome to the program, Dr. Aranda, and thank you for all that you do for the community and all that you've done to reimagine our gente in this world. So, un abrazo grande, primeramente.
Well, thank you. You're very generous, and again, I'm glad to be here. And it's been a wonderful time to know you and your family as well since I think more or less the mid '90s. I think
Oh my
we,
gosh.
yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a little while. And I do want to ask you about your background in Houston, but I got to ask you more about these 7,600 miles. So how many days is that?
It's not as much as you'd think it would be. I think the first summer, this we were driving around to do interviews for Krista's project, Krista Comer, my wife, and so she has a project called
Also brilliant.
yeah. Thank you. Living West as Feminist, and we drove around, meeting up with colleagues, scholars, of friends, feminist friends of hers, and the project was to uh, talk with them about their work, their
Mhm.
scholarship, but more importantly, talk about how they engage with the topic of feminism or as feminists in the places they live in the West. So we interviewed a lot of people that first summer in New Mexico and Montana and California. And then this last summer, we finished that project, interviewing people in Oregon, in Nebraska, and Waterloo, Canada. So you have to drive a lot to get in, get to these people. And so it was a kind of COVID inspired project to get reconnected, to know where people live as opposed to meeting people at conferences or hotel lobbies and things like that. But we met a lot of cats and dogs and nice children as well.
I love it. And to me, that sounds like a great dive into community cultural capital and really
Mhm.
humanizing folks. So
Right, right.
fantastic. We're gonna have to follow up and do some interviews on that going into the future. But let's talk about your past because you are a homegrown hero. Eres del barrio. You were a squinkler here in Houston, Texas. So tell folks about that because I'm very proud that you're part of our backyards, our gente. Tu ombligo está aquí.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I'm a homie, as they say, or they used to say. I was literally born in Magnolia Oaks, in the east end of Houston. I was born in the corner of Harrisburg and 75th, when Parkview Clinic was Parkview Hospital. And that's where I was born. My two brothers were born. My sister, the younger one, the youngest of our family, she was fancy. She got to be born here at the medical center. So she was always special. But I repeat that to say that the fact that I was born in Magnolia meant that there was a real barrio, and the barrio had all sorts of services, including health services and his own little hospital. And if you know the barrio, I know you do, Tony. It's right up against. It's between Gulf Freeway on one side and the Chip Channel on the other end. So that's where I grew up. I went to first schools I went to was De Zavala for kindergarten, and then Franklin Elementary for first and second grade. And then at that point, my parents wanted us to do the parochial route, so I went to Immaculate Heart of Mary right there in the heart of Magnolia, and then from there we went to Blessed Sacrament in the second ward, and from there I went to St. Thomas High School, and
Um,
I just kind of moved a little westward, until I hit Saint Thomas, and then at that point, it's the late '70s, and because of affirmative action and good people, good teachers I had, good white teachers, good liberals I had, I ended up going to Yale, um, and graduated from Yale University as an English major. And then I came back, taught high school at Strake Jesuit
Wow.
for a couple of years. Decided that I liked teaching, but that the mission of teaching young men required a lot more patience than I had, and a lot more energy than I had. But I was really just wanted to go back to school. I really missed being in the classroom. So ended up going back east, this time to Brown University. And that's where I took my PhD there at Brown University. And then one thing led to another. And eventually I got the position here at Rice back in 1994. And so I was really just here at Rice as a professor. I was back home, right,
Mm,
with Krista and then our first son, Benito. But really, I just been here 2 or 3 years, and then I met you, really. And so it was really in that early period of coming to terms with
mm,
having been away from Houston to get this education, and then returning with Krista and Benito, and then later Jesse was born, and then coming to terms with how Houston had changed between,
mm.
in so many ways, between 1980 to the mid 90s, and that 15-year span, Houston had changed tremendously, and you were part of that change as well.
You know what, too? Your trajectory touches on so many important moments historically. You alluded to affirmative action, which right now is being contested again. Um, Looking back, what were the esperanzas of young Chicanas, Chicanos from the East End to get into Ivy League schools, at that time? You mentioned Yale, Brown, you're teaching at Rice. What were the esperanzas and possibilities of young Chicanas, Chicanos at that time to get into those schools?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's a great question because I think there were different conversations going on by the time I got to high school. One of the conversations was this older conversation from um, um, the Chicano movement, and organizers and activists, and all the stuff that was going on in the late '60s, from Head Start,
Mm,
to changing how HISC segregated students of color, to how universities were starting to open up their admission processes, whether it was Rice, which hadn't admitted a person of color really until the early '60s, when they had to go to the court to dissolve their charter
mm,
and rewrite their charter, uh, compared to University of Houston, which opened up in the 1930s and catered to the broad ethnic
mm,
uh, spectrum of Houston from the very start. So there was a lot going on there. But I think among, you know, the my generation, that kind of cusp between Boomer and Gen X, and then Gen X, I think the affirmative action conversation was really um, uneven. It depended where you grew up. If it was Houston, it sounded one way. If it was LA, it sounded a different way.
mm,
One of the surprises I had when I first landed at Yale in New Haven back in the fall of 1980 was that uh, all these Chicanos and Chicanas from the valley, they were more politically aware, more politically active. They understood why affirmative action was so necessary, and
mm,
they understood why what it meant to be at Yale. And I was just kind of coming out of this parochial Catholic system,
mm.
and I just felt I just felt lucky to get out of town, Yeah, but I was really surprised
Mm,
how clued in they were, and it wasn't until years later that I understood they were clued in, because they were coming from part of Texas that had been really politicized during the Chicano movement,
Wow.
and the political activity there of the activists and educators really under they were the ones that they were the beneficiaries of all that groundswell
Mm.
of activism around education. So they understood what it meant to be there, and I literally profited from watching them and literally watching them how they navigated the classroom, for example, and how they organized around mecha and how they understood themselves Chicanos and Chicano power and all that. All that, even though it was here in Houston, that was really not something that was exposed to in my friend circle or family circle.
Mhm. That's so powerful. And of course, with every sentence, we're unearthing more and more history that we want to
Right.
delve into. So I'm going to invite folks to watch this interview at their leisure, share it in a class. They can email us questions because unfortunately, we're going to resist all those amazing questions you brought up because they do lead up to your amazing book. And I want to tell folks the title again: The Places of Modernity in Early Mexican American Literature, 1848 to 1948. And I like to say that you're touching on a moment before we were a demographic. And I say that especially after our conversation right now, because I think if you are right now a Latino, or if you are if you've reached self determination, you call yourself Chicana, Chicano. If you're aware of your history, we're still navigating identity terms
Mhm.
that mean one thing in this era after we've been defined as a demographic, for good and for bad. Um, is it fair to say that your book is touching on the moments before we became the demographic that we imagine ourselves somewhat now?
I think so, Tony. I think if you, I like the way you use demographic in the sense that it's about a certain kind of visibility that has kind of political ramifications or political efficacy. So we weren't a demographic in that sense in the years between 1848 1948. We were certainly present, but that presence wasn't really adding up to influencing politics, influencing policy at K through 12 standards in Texas. It wasn't really influencing the racial discussions that were happening in the barrios versus the other neighborhoods in Houston. But certainly, um, we were growing as a community and in those 100 years, and certainly within the community, we were a demographic. I think it's interesting to look back and think about how people talked about themselves, and comunidad was a word, colonia was a word, barrio was a word, um, and in hyphenated terms, like you were already uh, referencing, were there already, whether you're Hispano American or Spanish American or Mexican American. Certainly, those terms were there, but whether the rest of the country were aware of us, it wasn't really an awareness that now a demographic label attaches. Now, we're the next biggest minority voting bloc. Uh, we're the shapers of the next political generation. Um, we're we're the peoples whose complexities are both uh, problematic to some other communities, but also exciting to uh, most communities. So we weren't exciting to all communities in those first 100 years.
And also along those same lines, I'd love for you to break down for our viewers and listeners why you focus on those 100 years, and that reveals so much about the main point of the book.
Yeah, I took a lot. This book took me a long time to research, and it took a long time to write. And then when it came down to figuring out how to give it its final shape, I realized that the field of Mexican American studies, Chicano studies, Chicanx studies, hadn't really thought about its literary production or print production, print culture in terms of the first 100 years. And I looked at all the work I had in this manuscript, and I said, "Oh, I am talking about the first 100 years." And in my mind too, I had Marquez's title for his famous novel 100 Years of Solitude. So something about the the kind of range that 100 year gives potential reader, but also something about that solitude of Marquez's book also resonated for me in terms of giving it a subtitle for this book, because certainly the people who I talk about, the writers I talk about, the communities I write about in this book, they knew each other. It's just that they existed in this somewhat heavily segregated, heavily supervised divisions uh, in the time period between those first 100 years. So there was a kind of artificial solitude that people had to work with and work against. And anyway, so that's how it came together. And also, there's an interesting moment in 1948 when all the Chicano vets are coming back from service during World War II. And the Chicano and Chicano historians have talked about the Mexican, what they call the Mexican generation, right after the war. And that became a good place to stop, because that's exactly when the idea of a Chicana community or Chicano community was becoming more and more prevalent. And you can really see in my research, I can really see the difference that happens after 1948. So I say, okay, this is a good place to stop. And perhaps there's another book there between 1948 and 1968, but I'll leave that for another day.
Awesome. I think we got an exclusive there.
Yeah.
We got the preview of the other book. Now, I think folks, especially from Texas, should be really part of the, and California should be part of the book, because you are turning on its head an approach that I think hurts us as Tejanos, Californios, in that you're attacking regionalism, approaching it in a certain way where I think in the modern day, you know, one quick example, um, if you're talking about visual art movements and you have a discussion about, Chicano visual artists from Houston, your mainstream art institutions look down on it for reasons that it are regional, and this is not the region considered
Right.
fertile or important. And we on the ground know that that's not the case. Talk to us about that regionalism and how it does affect how we're perceived, and how you approach it a very different way in your book.
Well, I think the traditional kind of U.S. popular culture sense of Mexican American regionalism is that quote unquote Mexicans live in places like San Antonio or Los Angeles, Albuquerque. Um, yeah, but the regionalism that the Recovery Project has helped me to understand is that um, certainly places like San Antonio or LA, Albuquerque are really important to Mexican American history, but these are all these other sites of growth around community, around labor, around arts, literature, newspapers, and these are the places like Houston. Uh, they weren't instantly traditionally understood as Mexican, but that over time became increasingly quote unquote Mexican. And there's also this older regionalism that the book tries to sort of shed light on, and that was the regionalism that came out of the Spanish colonial matrix from between 1492 to 1821. And then on top of that, a kind of Mexican geographic imaginary that also understood its northern territories as el norte, right? And so what's fascinating about doing the kind of research or teaching the kind of books that I teach here at Rice is that you're always somewhere, but in some ways that somewhere it's almost always at the same time getting destabilized. So you really have to know your history. Like if it's before 1821, it's the Spanish crown controls things. It's if it's after 1821, it's the Mexican Republic that controls things. If it's after 1848, it's this U.S. Anglo-American regime that controls things. So um, by controlling, I mean understanding the logics of how people live, how people did commerce, how people understood the laws, how they show up in court. Literally, it's very different, and so some of the regional habits that remain after 1848 end up becoming terms like Tejano, Tejana, or in California, los Californios. These are all or names and language that resonate about a prior past. And so, I, I guess what's really different about my use of regionalism is that it's never static, and it's always evolving, and it has a lot of to do with movement of people, um, and with people ideas move. And what's really great about this research that I was able to do is that when people move from one region to another, or from Mexico to the United States, they motivate people to write. And that was the fascinating thing about this project, is to ask the question, why do people write? Why do they set up all these newspapers to all these cities, from Brownsville to San Francisco in California? Why do they write when they understood clearly that the rest of the country looked at them as second class citizen, not capable of all the rights and privileges of citizenship? But people decided to write and create newspapers, and set up their own schools for their children, because they understood that writing was one of the ways, at least one of the ways, to create community, but also to pass on uh, the best parts of their traditions to the future.
And I'm going to give you fair warning. After this question, I'm going to ask you to read an excerpt from the
Okay.
book. I want to remind folks, too, that we're chatting with Dr. Jose Aranda. He's a tenured professor in Chicano at Rice University. We're talking about his amazing book, The Places of Modernity in Early Mexican Literature, 1848 to 1948. And by the way, you can take his classes. Oh my gosh, that's got to be so awesome to take a class with you. But I remember as I was reading the book too, I felt that founding Nuestra Palabra was unearthing some of these issues. You were kind of explaining so much to me when I was reading the book, because one of the reasons to start Nuestra Palabra is there wasn't a evident voice for Latino writers.
Mm-hmm.
And as you talk about regionalism, as you talk about identity, as you talk about the role of writing, that to me revealed just some of the deeper issues. It isn't just about corporate New York not publishing our voices. That's part of it. But it's all these other layers as well that really makes it clear to me what a challenge it is, but also because I don't want to leave people depressed. I want people to be fired up, because I get so excited when I read your book. It's also exciting because that's what we're overcoming. And to me, when we organically bring it together, we've been doing it. When I read your book, I'm like, we've been doing this. We've been a gente beforehand. We
Yeah.
don't need all that other stuff. I mean, we should demand it and expect it, but even without it, we thrive so much.
Yeah, it is a weird. I know it's a weird feeling of history to both understand that the community has been as strong as you can imagine it, and that its members have been diverse as you can imagine it, and alive and engaged as you can imagine it. But at the same time, depending on the historical moment, completely isolated, completely abandoned by the federal government, completely ignored by other power structures, whether it's Madison Avenue in New York City or any great university then or now. Um, and so when I look at this material that the recovery project that Nicholas Canelos and others have brought to help us bring together, I feel alive. I feel like centered. But when I move my head elsewhere, I feel all instantly shut down and dislocated. So part of the reason to do this kind of work and to teach this kind of work coming out of the recovery project is, like you said, to remind us, yeah, we have a very rich and healthy uh, history and deep traditions and um, scores and scores of writers and lawyers and politicians and all that, but this kind of artificial amnesia that we tend to trip out into once we leave the barrio or we close the book is a function of a much older, deeper, and yet active hostility to what our communities and very similar Latinx communities have been producing uh, forever. And so, um, I think that your work, Tony, is always about working against this artificial amnesia. So um, we're part of a bigger impulse that's been there for such a long time, and it will be there for a few more years at least. I hope it's short, but I have a feeling it's going to be a little longer.
Well, on that note, I would love for you to read an excerpt from the book, "The Places of Modernity in Early Mexican Literature, 1848 to 1948." Dr. Aranda reading an excerpt for us.
All right. So this is I'm going to read from my. I think this is the third chapter. This is a chapter where I feature the interesting work that the granddaughter of M.G. Vallejo of California, the granddaughter, her name is Francisca Vallejo, was doing in the 1930s. And she's a mature writer, musician, a musical composer by this time. But um, she had a radio show. And so, in honor of your radio show, I thought I would read this excerpt. Um, on the night of May 25th, 1936, at 7:45 p.m. on Radio KYA, Francisca Vallejo began her first episode of a radio program to which listeners could dial in 3 times a week to hear her narrate old California stories. Perhaps such listeners would do so to forget for a moment the economic depression they were enduring. Perhaps they would dial in to drown out the news of mass deportation of Mexican and Mexican Americans on the one hand, or the unprecedented number of Okies and Arkies migrating from the drought stricken Dust Bowl of the Great Plains on the other. Or perhaps they dialed in just curious to hear what the granddaughter of Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo had to say. And I'm going to quote her now. This is her, and this is what she said, or some version of what she said that night back in 1936. Buenas noches, amigos. Good evening, friends. This is Francisca Vallejo speaking. It is my privilege to announce that I should bring to you a series of programs which I have written around the history and romances of our wonderful California. We shall dip into lore and legend, play her traditional music, and learn to know her with a deep understanding and affection. Occasionally, I may present one of my own compositions, and from time to time, I shall speak to you of Chamberlain's Lotion, which is sponsoring these programs. I know you are going to share my enthusiasm for this splendid product. I just give it a trial. Unquote. For the rest of the 1936 into 1937, Francisca Vallejo will regale her listeners with stories of old California, its discovery and the establishment of the mission system, tales of bandits, romances, native legends, and seminal moments like the Bear Flag Revolt. Along the way, Vallejo writes episodes devoted to the flora and fauna and ecosystems, reminding her listeners of the national treasures of California. We would call it environmental writing today. Local tribes are also featured, as well as details about ranch life and domestic homemaking by the Doñas. Hers is an insider journey into a past well trodden by historians of the period. Whatever novel content she provides is by virtue of her family genealogy and intimate access to her father's Ladrón Viejo's rich recollection of her grandfather, Guadalupe Vallejo. Embedded here and there are Francisco Vallejo's subtle but clear family grievances she literally airs over the airways. Squatters, land grant disputes, and unscrupulous lawyers find their way into her program. And so I'll stop right there. And so I bring that, I read that section, Tony, because in many ways you are part of a very long radio slash journalistic slash activist tradition of telling stories back to our communities and also encouraging our communities to learn more about their rich ethnic past, and not to get too distracted or discouraged when things are bad, like mass deportations in the 1930s, or the Dust Bowl, uh, creating what we would now call climate refugees, um, and creating also all sorts of labor issues in California at the same time. And so she was very much aware of the politics of her time, but she had an opportunity to tell stories on the medium that was the most accessible at the time, radio. And radio didn't care who was listening, and it just cared that you were on. And of course, there's a little bit about the product endorsement there. Chamberlain's lotion. You got to pay the bills, Tony.
Well, I want to announce our new sponsor. That's amazing. I'm so glad you read that because I was enthralled by it in the book. I wanted to ask you that questions, but it does give me a chance to remind our listeners we don't have sponsors, which may explain, especially in light of that, um, why we are. I think we're the only FM radio show in Houston that can do the programming that we do, which is our terms on our terms, our community on our terms. And of course, for KPFT, we go to the listeners. So I want to remind listeners, if you can, please make a donation to KPFT. You can visit kpft.org and click on the donation button or the tip jar. Make a donation in the name of Nuestra Palabra, Latino writers having their say. But again, I was going to ask you about that because I was enthralled by that. Because here you have a woman on air navigating exactly like you're saying, because you got to pay the bills. If she doesn't have a sponsor, she's not going to be on air, and she's got to talk about topics that will interest the listeners. But still, she adds some of the social issues. She adds some of the historical issues that won't get play any other way.
Exactly. Uh, and she was already part of a family tradition that was doing this one way or the other, but she was at that moment the most capable of that Vallejo family, and certainly that's a family that already had lots of privileges, a lot of privileges that a lot of people would object to now. But she was in a position to do something and make an argument to all her listeners about this uh, older California, Mexican, Spanish, indigenous past that by the mid 1930s was already getting commodified in architecture, commodified in all sorts of romance films from Hollywood, um, and also commodified in the sense that um, uh, that was the past, and that California's future was going to go somewhere else. She was in so many ways saying that California's future was already uh, predicated by people like her family and New York people of Mexican descent who were arriving in California daily, either from Mexico or from other places in the Southwest at the time. So she was part of that very forward-looking generation of Mexican American women who understood that there was a need to um, not only tell stories, but make sure that the stories went somewhere, that got institutionalized, got archived, became part of a broader narrative that was not so easily sequestered in some dusty bin or some forgotten archive.
And we're gonna have to appeal to the listeners here because we're getting some great reactions. We got Chicano visual artist Rigo Miller, dear friend of the show. He just posted, "This is awesome." He means you, Dr. Aranda. And want to give a shout out to Sandra Jean Torres. She's saying, "Bring it to San Antonio." Also, I got to give a shout out to the Latino bookstore. I'm proud to be literary curator for the Latino bookstore at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. And your book is in stock. And if enough people demand it, we'll have to keep getting more of it. But we got to get you on the road to San Antonio también. But she's giving us en eso, así, así, gracias. I feel like Johnny Canales, the literary Johnny Canales, for a little bit. People can Google who he was.
Oh, he was big. He was
Right.
big.
Right, for music, not books, pero I vamos. But I do want to talk more about that because to me it was fascinating to hear how even at that moment we weren't a demographic. We're talking about regionalism, but there was a mainstream romanticizing of our history and culture in a way for profit, for products, for
Right.
tourism. And here she's got to ride that fine line where she plays into it, but she still wants the authentic story to come out. You break that down really well in the book. Tell us a little more about it. And I think the listeners want to hear you read more, but hey, that's just me.
Oh, that's really nice of them. Well, I think that's one of the good things about looking at the first 100 years of these diverse Mexican American communities, because you really do find a range of actors or agents. One of the privileges I have as an educator is having access to a lot of these archives, and one of the best archives that's come out of the Recovery Project is the collection on Spanish the Spanish speaking press, Spanish reading press of the United States. And when you look at the newspapers, whether it's in the 1800s or the early 1900s or the mid 20th century, you realize very quickly that the people who are producing these newspapers and the people who are buying these newspapers um, occupy a range of political ideologies. They're not. It's both homogeneous in a sense, but very heterogeneous. And so, a person like Francisca Vallejo, on the one hand, uh, coming out of a fairly elite California landed gentry of before 1848, but then after 1848, they lose their lands. There were lands that were unceded indigenous lands anyway, and yet they instantly move from being colonizers to being colonized to being cultural producers in the 1930s, that telling a complicated story. And I think in many ways the reason I wanted to put this book out is to reflect that back into our late 20th century, early 21st century communities, and very, very complex communities right now. On a political scale, we're very complex. In terms of cultural production, we're very complex. The mediums have been uh, blown up. We have print culture, we have filmmaking, we have all sorts of social media sites, YouTube. People are producing things for YouTube all over the place, and so there's not. If back then there wasn't one way of characterizing what was the Mexican American community, except for its obvious Spanish language or historic ties to Mexico. Today, we're also equally or more more unequally diverse than ever at the same time, and yet we all are connected precisely because we are forced artificially to struggle with our Mexican heritage in ways that the broader hegemony asks us to give up our identities, give up our Spanish, give up our traditions, uh, and in some ways give up our diversity as well among ourselves. Just become one thing. I'll pause right there because I'm losing it in my mind.
No, no, no. I love it, and I think those are great facets to bring up. And unfortunately, we can't read your whole book out to the audience. And we gotta sell some books. So people gotta I encourage people to pick up your book to support local bookstores like
Yes.
the Latino bookstore in San Antonio, Casa Ramirez in Houston, and any of your other favorite small local bookstores. But I want to close with the following question. You learn from the past, and this is from Roxana, our producer. You learn from the past. What do you recommend Latino youth to read now or pay attention to?
Oh, thank you, Roxana. Uh it you know what? I think some basic thing needs to happen for all our youth, and especially in a place like Texas. And Tony, you know this better than I do. All the funding that's been going on for the last 30 years, it feels like what we need to help our kids just basically read whatever they want to read. But if you go to libraries, and I recommend that, or bookstores, I recommend that too, you just need to guide our young ones to these sections where we show up. It's plain and simple. These are the sections that are for us. Go to the website of Arte Público Press. You will see there's so many titles there for children, for young adults, and of course for adults. There is really not the same lack of opportunity to to read uh, about our communities, and I think um, thankfully there are more people of Mexican descent, Latinx descent, in colleges, universities, community colleges. Uh, just go to school, stay in school, and if you see a brown person in front of you in front of you in the classroom, uh, uh, thank them for being the teachers. We all need more teachers like them.
I love it. And we're going to give the last word to Sandra Jean Torres. She says she'll definitely buy the book. We
Oh,
need to be educated on our history so we can make life better for our youth and ourselves. We've been chatting with Dr. Jose Aranda. We're talking about his book, The Places of Modernity in Early Mexican American Literature, 1848 to 1948. I'm Tony Diaz, the Libro Traficante. I want to say thank you to our producers, Roxana Guzman, Rodrigo Bravo, to the whole Nuestra Palabra team. We appreciate you tuning in. And of course, this will be airing across several platforms. You can email us if you enjoyed the interview to ask more questions, the follow up. And in closing, Dr. Aranda said it, support our writers and our literature. Thank you so much for all you do, Dr. Aranda.
thank
Gracias.
you, Tony. Good night.
Good night.